Hey guys, it's Miss Patrick. I'm going to be reading our Littles book today. I'm going to read chapters 7, 8, and 9. I hope you've enjoyed the book so far. Here is our first picture. There's two littles on the number 7. Does this make you wonder if there's littles living in your house? Mr. Little and Tom were not the only littles who fought with mice that day. Uncle Pete and Lucy had a narrow escape in the cellar. They had been burning trash at the hot water heater when two mice trapped them. Uncle Pete and Lucy were under the water tank next to the burner, and there was no safe way out. At first, Uncle Pete tried to fight them off with his bow and arrows, but the old bowstring broke with the first shot, and he missed. Luckily, Uncle Pete had made 2 torches from burnt matches he found near the heater. He had wrapped rags around the ends of the matchsticks, then he dipped them in a puddle of oil near the furnace. When the bowstring broke, Uncle Pete lit the torches. He and Lucy waved them at the mice and frightened them away. Back in the safety of their rooms, Uncle Pete made a new bowstring. He waxed it carefully and strung it on the bow. "Someone's going to get hurt if this keeps up," said Miss Little. "When are the Newcombs going to help us?" "Probably never," said Uncle Pete. "Tom has a plan," said Mr. Little. "It's a good plan, and I think it will work. Tell your idea, Tom." "Well," said Tom, "those Newcombs never see the mice, so they don't bother to set traps, right?" Tom's mother nodded. "Suppose we show them a mouse. Then they'll know, right?" How do we do that?" said Uncle Pete. "We don't have any mice. Your mouse got away, and my bowstring broke." "We don't want them to see a dead mouse anyway," said Mr. Little. "Then what on earth is the boy talking about?" said Uncle Pete. "Get to the point." "Suppose I dressed up like a mouse," said Tom. "I could run across the kitchen floor right in front of Miss Newcomb." Here's our picture. "Good heavens," said Uncle Pete. "Is this woman an idiot? Couldn't she tell a fake mouse from a real one?" "If the fake mouse went fast enough," said Miss Little, "she might think it was real." "There's only one thing wrong with Tom's plan," said Mr. Little. "I'll do the mouse running. As head of the family, it's my job." "But, Dad, you're too big," said Tom. "I'm just the right size. It won't look right if you do it." "Oh, dear," said Miss Little. "Do you think so?" "The boy's right," said Uncle Pete. "If we're going to use this plan, let's do it right. He's the perfect size for the job." It was decided Tom would play the part of the mouse. Mr. Little would go with him to tell him when and where to run. Granny Little set to work making the costume. By the next afternoon they were ready. Tom was dressed in the costume. He looked quite a bit like a real mouse, even from close up. Granny Little had done her work well. She had sewed on ears and whiskers. Tom used his own tail, of course. His mother oiled and brushed on the hair so it had the shape of a mouse's tail. And here is our pictures. There's Granny Little sewing, and then here is Tom in his costume. I think he looks like a mouse. They did a good job. "Tom, you look a fright," said Mr. Little. Uncle Pete came into the room. "Miss Newcomb's in the kitchen now," he said. "It's time you two got moving." Just a minute," said Granny Little. She was on her knees making some last-minute changes. "It's too loose around the ankles. You don't want him to trip, do you?" Lucy stood behind her mother, sneaking looks at Tom. "Mother, doesn't he look awful?" she said. "I want to see myself in the mirror," said Tom. Hold still," said Granny Little. She worked for a moment longer. "There!" She stood up and looked at her work. "Granny, it's wonderful," said Miss Little. "It's awful," said Lucy. The family followed Tom as he squeaked and galloped on all fours over to the mirror. "Tom," said Mr. Little, "this is not a joke. I want you to remember that." "I'm practicing," said Tom. "The boy is high-spirited, that's all," said Uncle Pete. "I was that way myself when I was his age." Mr. Little had to pull his son away from the mirror. "Come, Tom," he said, "we're wasting time. Miss Newcomb may not be in the kitchen for long." All the Littles went with Mr. Little and Tom down the passageway as far as the tin can elevator. Miss Little tried to kiss Tom, but the mouse costume covered his head. Instead, she pulled his tail gently. "Be careful, Tom. Do just as your father tells you," she said. "He'll be all right," said Mr. Little. "He knows what to do. We've gone over it and over it." "What's all the fuss?" said Uncle Pete. "They'll be back shortly." Mr. Little and Tom climbed into the tin can. They had rigged up the tin can elevator from an old soup can and bits of string tied together. The elevator dropped slowly out of sight. "It's the first time any of the big people have ever seen any of us," said Miss Little, "and the only real part of Tom they'll see is his tail." Down in the kitchen, Mr. Little hid behind a basket. He's got ready to give Tom the signal to go. Here's the elevator that they made with the tin can. Oops, sorry. The tiny man held up his hand, waiting for the right moment. If Miss Newcomb was too close, she might step on Tom, but if she weren't facing the right way, she might not see Tom run across the floor. Mr. Little waited. Tom watched his father carefully. Miss Newcomb turned towards the basket where Mr. Little was hiding. Mr. Little's hand dropped. Just then, Miss Newcomb started walking. "No, Tom, wait," whispered Miss Little. Too late. Tom Little came skittering across the kitchen floor, just in time to run between Miss Newcomb's feet. Mr. Little closed his eyes. "Ee!" shouted Miss Newcomb. "A mouse!" Here's Tom in between her feet. Mr. Little opened his eyes. Tom was safe under the radiator on the other side of the room. "Charlie!" shouted Miss Newcomb. "There's a mouse in the kitchen!" Mr. Newcomb came running. "This house has mice?" said Miss Newcomb. "One of them almost jumped on me." "Take it easy, Liz," said Mr. Newcomb. He got down on his knees and looked around. "Charlie, you must get rid of the mice," said Miss Newcomb. "I won't live in a house with mice." "We'll get rid of them," said Mr. Newcomb. "The Biggs must have mouse traps around someplace. Just don't get so excited, Liz. It's only a little mouse." "Don't get excited, you say," said Miss Newcomb. "You should have seen it. It ran straight at me. It might have bitten me, it came so close." "You think a mouse would bite you?" said Mr. Newcomb. "You can't tell," said Miss Newcomb. "You never can tell what a wild animal like that will do." Here's Tom in his little costume. Can you see? And here we're starting chapter 8. And Tom in his little costumes peeping through the 8. The Littles were very pleased with the success of Tom's plan. Mr. Little couldn't get over it. "I wish you all could have seen Tom," he said. Zip, he went right across the floor. "It's a mouse!" yelled Miss Newcomb. Oh my, it was something to see. "He's a little all right," said Uncle Pete. "He has that little bravery." "I only had a little bravery is right," Uncle Pete said. "Tom, I was kind of scared." All the Littles laughed except Uncle Pete. "Tom Little, you ripped this mouse costume," said Granny Little. She was looking at it under a light. "I'm sorry, Granny," said Tom. "I was going so fast I couldn't stop when I got to the other side of the room. I tore it on a nail under the radiator." "I'll fix it," said Granny Little. "You can wear it next Halloween." "I hate mice," said Lucy. "Don't wear that thing ever again, please." "Granny, you did a wonderful job on the costume," said Mr. Little, "but, well, no one really likes it. Do you know what I mean?" "No sense in wasting all that good work," said Granny Little. She started sewing. "We may need it again." "I'm not leaving my room until the mice are gone," said Lucy. "They'll be gone in a few days," said Mr. Little. "You'll see. Everything is going to be all right now." "I say, we should give Newcomb a helping hand," said Uncle Pete. He picked up a sword made from one of Miss Biggs' needles. "On guard!" Uncle Pete limped forward, waving that sword and stabbing the air. "Take that! And that!" "Oh, goodness, Uncle Pete! Do put that thing down," said Miss Little. "I hate to see those weapons around." She turned to her husband. Where can we put them back in the chest?" "As soon as the mice are gone," said Mr. Little. "I figure a few days at the most. In the meantime, I want all of you to watch out for the mouse traps. We don't want any accidents now that our troubles are almost over." "Why don't we stay in our rooms for the next few days?" said Miss Little. "Then we'll be safe from the traps and the mice." Uncle Pete didn't think so. "We should know what's going on at all times," he said. "Bad business sticking your head in the sand like an ostrich." "Let's look around once a day then," said Mr. Little. "That should be enough. I'm going down to the kitchen first thing tomorrow morning," said Uncle Pete. "I want to see those mouse traps with my own eyes." "May I go with Uncle Pete this time?" said Tom. "Lucy doesn't want to go. Do you, Lucy?" "I'm not leaving my room until the mice are gone," said Lucy Little for the second time. There's Lucy looking at the costume. Chapter 9. The next morning, Mr. Little was walking back and forth in the Littles' kitchen. Miss Little and Lucy sat at the table watching him. Granny Little was sitting at the table too, knitting. Mr. Little kept looking up at the clock on the wall. 10 o'clock, he said. And they're not here. They should have come back a half an hour ago. "Who's not here?" said Granny Little. "Uncle Pete and Tom," said Mr. Little. "They went to the kitchen to see if the mouse traps had been set." "What shall we do?" said Miss Little. Mr. Little strapped on his sword. "I'm going to find them," he said. "They're probably all right, but I can't stand the waiting." "I'd better go with you," said Miss Little. "No, I can handle it alone," said Mr. Little. "I want you here with Granny just in case." "Do you think mice would come here?" "No, but you can't be sure," said Mr. Little. "They did in '35. When there are enough of them, they'll try anything." When Mr. Little got to the kitchen, he couldn't find Uncle Pete and Tom. He didn't see any mouse traps either. He went to the cellar. Still no sign of the boy and his uncle, and there was no mouse traps in the cellar. "Something's wrong," thought Mr. Little. Mr. Little went to the garbage can. There had to be mouse traps there. It was the best place to catch mice. But there were none, and still no sign of the missing Littles. "It's very strange," thought Mr. Little. "No mice, no mouse traps, and no Tom or Uncle Pete." He decided to return to the kitchen. That's where Uncle Pete wanted to go in the first place. So Mr. Little turned back and headed for the kitchen. Meanwhile, back in the Littles' rooms, Lucy was thinking about her father. "Suppose he needs someone to send a message or something. I should have gone with him." She looked into the living room. Granny Little was sitting in her chair by the fireplace. Lucy's mother was watching the door, a kitchen knife in her lap. "I should be with my father," thought Lucy. Then suddenly she made up her mind. She ran to her room and got the bow and arrows. Then she slipped out the back door into the passageway. Mr. Little was in the kitchen under the radiator. He waited until he could hear the Newcombs talking in the living room. Then he felt it was safe to look around. Near the door to the dining room he came upon Uncle Pete's sword. Uncle Pete would never let go of his sword, he thought, unless it was knocked from his hands. This is bad. I wonder if... He put the thought out of his mind. "Don't think," he told himself. "Just keep looking." Mr. Little drew his sword. He went into the dining room. He kept close to the wall and walked slowly towards the fireplace. And here is Mr. Little walking slowly towards the fireplace. Just as Mr. Little was leaving the kitchen, Lucy got there. She saw her father go into the dining room, sword in hand. Lucy ran to catch up. Her father was only a few feet ahead of her when suddenly a giant cat leaped at him out of the shadows. Lucy was never so scared in her life. She ran towards the cat. She ran without thinking. The gigantic animal had attacked her father. She would save her father somehow. The tiny girl came up behind the cat. Its long tail swished back and forth over her head. She took an arrow and jabbed it as hard as she could into the cat's tail. And there's Lucy Little, jabbing her arrow into the cat's tail. "Yow!" yelled the cat, and it ran out of the dining room, through the hall, and into the living room. Mr. Little was not hurt. He jumped to his feet. At the same time, Uncle Pete and Tom came running out of the fireplace. They had been cornered by the cat and were hiding under the logs. "Let's get out of here!" yelled Mr. Little. He ran for the kitchen. "Not without this," said Uncle Pete. He bent down and scooped up his sword. The four Littles dashed under the radiator and through the trap door. And here they are, dashing under the radiator and through the trap door. And that finishes up chapter 9 today. And tomorrow we will finish the book. There's 2 chapters left. And that gives you an opportunity to take this test before spring break. How awesome is that? I hope you guys have been enjoying it. I love and miss you.